Hi there, I'm David Busch and this is Buschistory. Welcome back. At this point in time I'm taking a look at the 1950s and starting to march towards the end of the AP US History course. The exam is not too far away now, we're only a few weeks away, and there's still quite a bit to get done here. So let's see what we have here. The 1950s. 1950s, very confusing decade, if you like. We come out of World War II, and the United States is the king of the world. We are the only superpower. And then, of course, in 1949, the Soviet Union explodes their atomic bomb, and now there are two superpowers. Then we enter the 1950s, and not too long afterwards, we find ourselves involved in the Korean War. But there's another side to the 1950s. There's a whole social fabric. A social fabric that not really removed from the Cold War after the beginning of the Civil Rights era, but there's other stuff in terms of how people are living and how their lives are affected by what's going on in the 1950s. And that's kind of what I want to take a look at today. This is topic 24, the 1950s. Everything that I'm going to show you today is available on my website at buschistory.net. You're free to take a look at it and download and use anything you choose is on that website. That's why this is here. This is a free service, hopefully helping people get a better understanding of American history and do better in their American history classes. So, without further ado, let's take a look. Typically, Hollywood portrays the 1950s as a time of contentment. Everything is going fine, rock and roll is starting, everyone is happy, we have bobby socks, we have dancing, we have malt chops, we have cruising in cars. Well, there probably is that side to it as well, but there's also a feeling of general angst. If you don't conform in the 1950s, you're an outcast. You could be a communist. Are we afraid of World War III with the Soviet Union and with atomic bombs? Are we very uptight because we don't want to behave the wrong way? Do we want to just be like everybody else? Well, let's take a look and see where we go with this. One of the really cool things that happens is we enter this time period that has come to be known as the baby boom. Soldiers have come home from war. They've come home from war, families have been delayed, and now they're doing all kinds of stuff and making babies. And if you take a look, the amount of births in the United States is just incredible. One baby is born every 7 seconds in 1957. A cool quote that I found: it seems to me that every other young housewife I see is pregnant. And that's from a British tourist in 1958. Very interesting. Now just imagine the power that that generation will have as it goes forward. So many people, so many resources necessary to service them, so many people going to school. It's going to be a very influential group of people. My group of people. Take a look at what happens with school enrollment as a result of this. So here we have in millions, 1910, 1920, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70. The children that are born in the 1950s are going to school in the 1960s and even more so in the 1970s as the birth rate continues to rise. It's pretty wild. Now just think about all the schools that have to be built. Think of all the school budgets that are going to rise. Think of all the textbooks that have to be manufactured. Think of all the teachers that are needed in these schools. And think of all the professionals that are going to be turned out from these schools and the consumers in our consumer-driven society. And where are they going to live? They're going to live in suburbia. We are going to mass-produce homes the way Henry Ford mass-produced cars. The homes are going to look alike, different colors. They're going to look alike. The neighborhoods are going to be alike. People are going to live together with a common set of rules. These baby boomers, as they're going to be called, they're going to live in these communities, and they're all like one after another. The building lots are the same size. We start to have standardization of lumber sizes. So rooms are certain sizes, and developers who are building these things can order the lumber almost pre-cut, and these houses are going to be put together one after another, after another, after another. Think about the industries that are going to service the baby boom. Think about all of the industries that go into housing. It's not just the construction industry, it's the lumber industry, it's the automobile industry, because you got to drive there. You're going to have shopping centers develop, and later on shopping malls develop. You're going to have landscapers, you're going to have movie theaters. It's all going to come as these families develop. So, do you think it's going to be easy to be different living in a community like this? You're probably going to have to conform quite a bit. You're going to think you're different, but you're going to be so much like other people who also think they're different. The population is going to shift. You're going to have more people moving into suburbia. Take a look. By 1970, we have almost half the population, 41.6%, living in suburbia. But in 1940, we only have 19.5% living in suburbia. So you have this flight from the cities that are largely fueled because of the car. We're also going to have a huge increase in credit debt. Not just credit cards, it'll be home debt as well in terms of mortgage. But take a look. Take a look at what's happening with the amount of money that people are borrowing. It's skyrocketing because as these houses develop and these neighborhoods develop, people will be buying all kinds of things. Well, you have to have your television. Oh, wait a minute. You have to have a second one and third one as well, because you have to have the one in the living room. You have to have the one in the game room later on. You have to have the one in the bedroom. You have to have the one in the kitchen. So lots of stuff to buy. And of course, you have to put that fence up, and you're going to charge that at Sears. And you have to have that washer and dryer. And it's all going to be done on consumer credit. And credit itself will become a major industry as a result. The car culture. Where would we be without our cars? We're America. We drive. Take a look. Car registration 1945, 25,000. In 1960, 25 million. In 1960, 60 million people own cars. Unbelievable. We have two-family cars. It used to be you had one car. Car was just a symbol of your wealth. But now we have more wealth, so now we have two cars that are symbolizing our wealth. They should be transportation. Well, that ended in the 1920s when cars were just a symbol of transportation. Now they're a symbol of wealth because of what kind of car do you have? Oh, really? How big is it? How fast does it go? What does it have inside of it? And all of those things are going to fuel other industries as well. In 1956, President Eisenhower signs into law the Interstate Highway Act. Now, it sounds like a great idea. Let's build highways across the country. Do not be misled. The Interstate Highway Act was about moving troops, soldiers, tanks, trucks, instruments of war across the country in case we are ever invaded by, guess who? The Soviet Union. Why would you have banked entrances and exits onto highways? Why do we have lanes that are wide enough to accommodate a tank? And why do we have overpasses tall enough to accommodate big trucks and tanks? Now, there is certainly an advantage to consumers as a result of this, but it's also going to mean everybody's going to want a car. And we're going to abandon public transportation for interstate travel, which probably in retrospect was not the greatest thing, but nevertheless, we did. And it becomes the largest public works projects in American history. 41,000 miles of new highways are built. Absolutely incredible. The United States is about 3,000 miles coast to coast, but we're going to get 41,000 new miles of highway. What's going to happen there? Well, as a result of that, the auto industry is going to become even bigger. Suburbia is allowed to develop because of the car. Well, it's like a chicken and egg thing. If you build it, they'll drive there. Or if you can drive there, we'll build it. And that's what happens as a result. We have shopping centers, and of course shopping centers need parking lots, which is going to mean a problem to downtowns in small villages and small towns as shopping centers are built on the outside of them. Drive-in theaters. No, you can't go and sit down in a movie theater now. You got to bring the car. So we'll sit down in a car. I'll put the little speaker in the window and I'll put the babe next to me and the kids in the back seat and we'll watch the horror flick. Well, that's going on as well. And then we have diners and motels. Motor hotels. Motels. Those are the places we stay alongside the highways. And then, of course, there are diners, because you have to dine when you stop at the motel for the evening. So it should be dinners. Dinners are served in diners. Pretty interesting, isn't it? And then we get what I like to call abusement parks. They're actually amusement parks, I get that. But I really think some sadists came up with the idea, because think about it. You go to an amusement park to get the crap scared out of you, and that's amusing! Anyway, amusement parks and Disneyland opens up in 1955. And Disney World, by the way, is 1970. Disneyland, California. Disney World, Florida. Disney World, they seem to never stop building Disney World. There's always something additional being added onto. But none of this is possible without the car. And let's not forget, by the way, the domestic oil industry. And thank you, John D. Rockefeller. And he's laughing over at your bank. Then we have television, because when we're not driving around our cars and shopping and spending all kinds of money, we had to sit home and look at our TV. And of course, the first TVs were this big, with a box this big. But it didn't matter, because it was new. Television to the 1950s was bigger than the internet in today's society, because people couldn't understand how this little box could have this person inside of it. When I was a small child in the 1960s, I truly believed that people lived in the box. And I used to leave food out for them. My mother, for a while, humored me, and she'd leave the food out too, and I'd come out in the morning, and it was gone. It was my father. My father was eating this stuff. But nevertheless, 1946, 7,000 TV sets in the United States. 1950, look, 4 years later, 50 million TV sets in the United States. And of course, the companies that are making those sets are laughing all the way to the bank. Early TV was kind of interesting. It was all about American values. Remember, the Red Scare is going on in the 1950s. So you can't have anything that's counter to the United States and our traditional values. So we have Superman. He's going to save the world. Able to leap tall buildings and jump off of things and do all kinds of great stuff. Then you have Daniel Boone. Yes. You need Daniel Boone. And then you have The Honeymooners. The first show about a goofy family in New York. We have Ralph Cramden, who's a bus driver, and all of his hijinks. Interesting story about The Honeymooners. There are only 24 original episodes to The Honeymooners, and it still lives on in reruns today. People are in love with that show. I never got it, frankly, but I do understand. It's one of those niche things. Nevertheless, television has become who we are, because now if you have television, guess what? You need an advertising industry. You need an advertising industry that makes it on television. So that is going to expand. And you're going to have jingle writers so people can sing these songs about it. You're going to have it your way, have it your way. And that's going to be the whole barbecue mantra. Anyway, let's take a look. Let's go further. Then we have this whole idea of everybody doesn't necessarily like conformity. And the teen culture is going to develop. Because what do teens do? Teens rebel. It's fun. And we have J.D. Salinger's Catcher in the Rye, about a teenager who's not too quite sure about what's going on in his life. You have The Beats by Jack Kerouac. He writes a book called On the Road. And the Beats are people who kind of look at the world a little differently. They are the forerunners of the beatniks and the hippies of the 1960s. You have James Dean as a cultural icon, with Rebel Without a Cause. I joke about Rebel Without a Clue. And you have Marlon Brando, before he ballooned up and became such a large man later on in life. And he's in The Wild One in 1953. So now there's a new audience. These teens who were born in the late 1940s, at the very, very beginning of the baby boom, they are now going to be enamored with these screen idols during the 1950s. All kinds of cool scientific advances, because now science is cool. We built the atomic bomb. What else can we build? So, in 1951, we get the first mainframe computer from IBM, and you know where that's going to go. In 1953, we have DNA. Why do we look the way we look? Why do we sound the way we sound? Why do we act the way we act? Our mothers did it to us. Anyway, DNA. In 1954, one of the coolest stories, Jonas Salk discovers and tests the polio vaccine. And then you know what he does? Instead of selling it, he gives it away. he says, this is too important to sell and make $1 million on. So he gives it away for the good of mankind. Very, very cool. 1957, the first commercial nuclear power plant. 1958, NASA, because of Sputnik in 1957. And in 1959, we get the first 7 American astronauts. Cool stuff going on in the 1950s. Some of it spurred by the Soviet Union and the Cold War. Some of it spurred by our own desire to learn more and improve ourselves. Images of the 1950s. Now, by the way, I am a child of the 1950s. I was born in 1958. But I don't remember these things, I was a little baby. But we have these duck and cover drills that I certainly did in the 1960s in elementary school. It was thought, think about this, if you hear those sirens, duck and cover. Get underneath the tables, get underneath your desk. This could have been me in elementary school. Those sirens that so many towns have that go off at a certain time, whether it be noon or 5 o'clock or 7 o'clock, they weren't put there so you could tell the time. And they weren't put there for the local fire department. They were put there to warn us of air raids. So if you happen to live near one of those, and I used to, and it goes off every day at 7 o'clock, yes, it goes off because they're testing it, not because it's 7 o'clock. And in time, as the threat of the Cold War eventually died down, they continued to use those sirens. They used them for fire alarms and other community events. Fallout shelters. Places to go in case of nuclear war on a lot of brick buildings in major cities. You would go to the basements. And in those fallout shelters, they had cans, these olive drab cans. They said civil defense cans. And in these cans, they had crackers and juice. So if you had to stay there for an extended period of time, you had crackers and juice. And of course, we have the pelvis. We have Elvis the Pelvis, the rock icon, the king of the 1950s. And this is from Jailhouse Rock. This is Jonas Salk on the cover of Time magazine. We already talked about why Jonas Salk is so cool. And this is a Bobby Soxer. I have to tell you, I had trouble finding an image of a Bobby Soxer from the 1950s. I really do think that this is a modern day incarnation of the 1950s Bobby Soxer. But that's okay. It's still cool. This was the girl that every guy wanted to date. Now we go from Eisenhower to JFK. Ike. I like Ike. Dwight Eisenhower dominated the politics of the 1950s. He was everybody's grandfather. People liked Ike, the hero of D-Day. He played a lot of golf. He seemed not to do a lot, although remember, he was part of the impetus in Brown versus the Board of Education. He told Earl Warren he wanted a unanimous decision. And he stared down Governor Faubus in the 1957 Little Rock crisis. In 1961, though, after the invasion of Cuba by Castro, or after the takeover, more likely, Castro didn't invade as much as he took over. But nevertheless, he gave a speech, his last speech to the American people. It's come to be known as the military-industrial speech. And in this speech, Eisenhower, looking kind of grandfatherly, sitting behind the desk in the Oval Office. And he said, beware the influence of the military-industrial complex, whether solicited or unsolicited. He thought that the military, having a close relationship with industry, was a bad idea. Because what does the military want? It wants new weapons. What does industry want? It wants more customers. So maybe, just maybe, that's a little too much power to have in that alliance. And looking back at it, he was probably right. A lot of people think the conflicts that followed in the 1960s through the year 2003 with the invasion of Iraq were fueled by businesses trying to make a lot of money. There is a discussion to be had there, because certainly people became rich in wars. And it's interesting that the man who was best known for being a warrior with D-Day and the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe leaves office only wanting peace. Pretty cool. And who does he leave office to? He turns the page. He hands the baton to a young John Kennedy. John Kennedy narrowly defeats Eisenhower's Vice President Richard Nixon by about 120,000 votes. An interesting story. An interesting story. Part folktale, part reality. John Kennedy needed certainly enough votes to get past Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was the wily old politician, well-schooled in politics, knew a lot about foreign policy, very bright man. John Kennedy is the upstart. He's the rich pretty boy from Massachusetts. He's the war hero with PT-109 in World War II. Well, as it turns out, the election was incredibly close. And as the story goes, Joseph Kennedy, John Kennedy's father, knew that his son needed some additional votes to get past Richard Nixon. And as a story goes, he calls up, who other? Mayor Daley in Chicago. Chicago politics, always fun. And says, we need some votes. And then somehow Frank Sinatra gets involved in this. And Frank Sinatra says, we need some votes. And you know what? Kennedy got some votes, and he beats Nixon by 120,000 votes. Nixon, according to the Constitution, because it was so close, had the right to a recount, and Nixon, to his credit, did not ask for a recount. And John Kennedy becomes the youngest elected president of the United States. And people love him. They love him, and they love Jackie. This is a very unfortunate picture, but it's a nice picture of them together. This is a picture of that morning in Dallas after they come off the plane, but let's not worry about that yet. So John Kennedy makes a speech and says, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. He calls on service. He wants to increase education in the United States. He promises to put a man on the moon before the end of the decade. So what does he do? He passes the Higher Education Act of 1963. He passes the Area Redeveloping Act, the Manpower Retraining Act, and he gets the Peace Corps off the ground. Pretty cool stuff. John Kennedy, even though he won by such a small margin, is a very dynamic president. He calls his presidency the new frontier. And one of the first things he does is he raises the minimum wage. He supported Medicare, federal aid to education, and urban renewal. He wanted to renew the cities. He wanted to make America better, and he had the young people behind him. Unfortunately, his presidency lasted a fabled 1,000 days, and they called it Camelot. He was the king, and she was the queen. Wages were raised from $1 to $1.25 an hour. That might not sound like a big deal, but take a look, guys. It's 25%. That is a huge increase in the minimum wage. If the minimum wage was to go up today by 25%, it'd be almost $2 increase in the minimum wage. That's a big deal over a 40-hour week. That's $80 a week. Multiply it out. That is significant in terms of raising the minimum wage. Now, John Kennedy was also the consummate Cold Warrior, but he had to learn on the job. He had to learn very quickly because he didn't have the experience that so many other people had in the Cold War. He gets us more involved in Vietnam. Lyndon Johnson, as I'll explain in my next presentation, is unfairly blamed for Vietnam. We were involved in Vietnam going all the way back to 1954 when the French were defeated at Dien Bien Phu. And President Eisenhower committed advisors. Well, John Kennedy commits more advisors. JFK views shifted from aggressive containment to making peace between the United States and the Soviet Union. He wanted to turn down the Cold War by showing the strength of the United States. So we build up weapons under John Kennedy. He also takes NSA 68 very, very seriously. When the National Security Council issued NSA 68, it was a secret document going all the way back to 1950. And what it really said was that we would do anything we could to contain communism. And it allowed for all kinds of hijinks by the CIA. So, under NSC 68, Kennedy sent more advisors, and he okayed the assassination of President Diem. John Kennedy okayed the assassination of a friendly government to the United States, of President Diem of South Vietnam, because he didn't like what President Diem was doing in South Vietnam in terms of the way the war was being run and in terms of the way he was dealing with his people. That's pretty incredible. Latin America. Latin America had incredible poverty, and this is another case of dollar diplomacy. John Kennedy is going to start something called the Alliance for Progress. The Alliance for Progress is John Kennedy's version of the earlier Taft idea of dollar diplomacy. Let's send aid into Latin America, and they will also be our friend because of it. It's like the Marshall Plan for Latin America. It really worked well in Europe. Why not let it work in Latin America? And he promised to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. And we do. He was really the face and the personality of the new young family and their goal-driven attitudes. Bay of Pigs is John Kennedy's foreign policy disaster. In 1959, Fidel Castro had come to power, and we now had a communist government in Cuba. And they had allied themselves with the Soviet Union because President Eisenhower cut off any kind of economic dealings with Cuba. And they needed a friend, so their friend became the Soviet Union. Well, as it turns, when the Batista government was thrown out and Castro took control, a lot of wealthy Cubans left Cuba and came to the United States. They lived just outside of Miami for the most part, something that came in was a little Havana. Well, we didn't want a Soviet satellite so close to the United States. So the CIA under Eisenhower hatched a plan using NSC-68 as the excuse again, where we would train these Cuban exiles, these guys who were never soldiers, they were middle-aged businessmen. I can just imagine like balding middle-aged businessmen go, oh, we're going to go home and liberate our country. So the CIA is training these guys, and they're going to go back to Cuba and start a revolution. The theory is the rich guys who left Cuba when Castro came are going to go back to Cuba with American weapons, and they're going to get all of the poor guys who probably didn't like them in the first place to help them overthrow Castro. Sounds like a great idea. Sounds like a great idea, right? So, Kennedy comes into the White House after Eisenhower leaves, and in January of 1961, he okays this invasion of Cuba. And the idea is, if they get bogged down when they're trying to invade Cuba, we will send in American air support to help them. Well, doesn't go so well. Let's see. It's April of 1961, and the invasion begins. But the problem is, in all this super secrecy, that we're not going to let anyone know about this, somebody didn't say, don't call home. So you had these exiles who were planning to invade Cuba, and they're calling their relatives in Cuba saying, hey guys, we'll be there next week. Well, obviously that wasn't going to stay a secret. And Castro had his army on the beach waiting for these exiles as they came ashore and basically mowed them down. So what did they do? They asked for American air support, and Kennedy said, no, this is a disaster, we're not going to do this. And the Bay of Pigs fails. The Bay of Pigs fails, and the United States looks ridiculous, and Castro is now stronger. And to John Kennedy's credit, he gets on TV and he says something along the lines, if victory has 1,000 friends, defeat is an orphan. And he takes responsibility for this failed invasion of Cuba. Pretty cool, but he also looks weak, and it's not going to happen twice. John Kennedy will have learned his lesson from the Bay of Pigs. If you take a look, here is a map of Cuba. Remember, Cuba is just about 90 miles south of the United States. It's so close that if you were in Key West, you could pick up Cuban radio stations. And this is the Bay of Pigs. And the idea was they would come around, invade. Not so much. Didn't go so well. But what that is going to mean to Cuba is going to have an excuse. Castro is going to have an excuse to ask the Soviet Union for more help. And what's going to happen is we're going to get what's come to be known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now think about this. Before we go into the crisis itself, be Fidel Castro. Late 1962. You said, oh, those Americans, they're trying to invade us. What do? Oh, let's ask our good friend, the Soviet Union, to help us. We need weapons. Khrushchev goes, we'll give you weapons, and you can defend yourself. So, along with conventional weapons and Soviet soldiers, Khrushchev also sends in long-range ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles. And we find out from spy shots as we're flying overhead, taking these spy photographs looking down, a little lens looking down, that we see all of these missiles laying on their side like this. And what we don't want is those missiles getting like this. So when it's reported to John Kennedy that the Soviet Union is putting missiles in Cuba, he says, you know what, we're not going to let them get like this. And there's a great debate. What do we do about this? Do we invade Cuba and take out these missiles? Joint Chiefs of Staff, the heads of the military, wanted to do that. Do we bomb Cuba and bomb the missile sites? Joint Chiefs of Staff want to do that as well. They want to make up for the Bay of Pigs. They want to invade Cuba. They want to bomb Cuba. They want to destroy Castro. They want him gone. John Kennedy says, well, I don't know, that might be the thing to do. We might have to do that. But is there another option? And John Kennedy is going crazy trying to figure out, what else can we do? What else can we do? What else can we do? And he launches into this series of back-channel negotiations, and that's exactly what they call. There are spies in Washington who work for the Soviet Union. Robert Kennedy is meeting with this spy in Washington who's sending information back to Khrushchev about, we really don't want to invade Cuba, but you put us in a bad position. Publicly, John Kennedy, after days of gathering his information, he gets on TV and he says the United States is aware of offensive nuclear weapons in Cuba. And he gets on TV and he says that an attack or a launch from Cuba of any nuclear weapon whatsoever will be looked at as an attack on the United States and will come with a full retaliatory response from the United States. So it plays out like this. They actually game this whole thing out. If the United States fires missiles on Cuba, the Soviet Union is going to retaliate. Now, because we destroyed the missile in Cuba, they're not going to retaliate in Cuba. They're going to retaliate in Europe at Berlin. Oh, okay. So they launch weapons at Berlin. And what are we going to do? Well, part of our NATO treaty says we're going to launch weapons back at Moscow. And there it is. There is World War III. And it's that close. It's that close. Because what happens is, prior to invasion and prior to bombing, John Kennedy announces a blockade around Cuba. And what it really means, he's going to ring Cuba with naval vessels, with ships. And those naval vessels are going to stop any Soviet ships from coming to Cuba, and they're going to search those ships. And if they find any offensive materials on those ships, they're going to confiscate the materials and turn the ships around. Now imagine this. Imagine, this is great in a war room in Washington, D.C. But you're going to put the captain of an American destroyer out on the Atlantic Ocean near Cuba to go eyeball to eyeball with the captain of a Russian freighter or a Russian warship coming towards Cuba. And they're going to be out there. And all you're going to need is someone with an itchy trigger finger, and you're going to have one ship shooting at another ship. And that's going to be the beginning of the war as well. And then we come to find out that as the Soviet ships are approaching Cuba, they're being accompanied by nuclear submarines underneath them. So American ship on the surface, Soviet ship on the surface, in between them, nuclear submarine. Now what? Do we depth charge a nuclear submarine and attack a Soviet war submarine, warship? Do we stop the ship on the surface? Do we board the ship on the surface? This is crazy, crazy close stuff. Well, as it turns out, this goes on for about 13 days, this whole angst in the United States and the Soviet Union. As it turns out, a secret deal is made. And the deal goes like this. The Soviet Union will remove all nuclear weapons from Cuba, period, and it can be inspected. If the United States removes weapons we have in Turkey that are pointed at the Soviet Union, but the weapons in Turkey will be removed sometime later on. I think it's about 6 months later. And there's no direct connection. It's not that we removed ours, so you will remove yours, and the United States will deny that. So what happens is Khrushchev goes for it. Khrushchev goes for it, and the missiles are removed from Cuba, and the immediate reaction is the United States stared down the Soviet Union. So this is John Kennedy's foreign policy victory. This is his big Cold War moment, and it works. And it works, and John Kennedy's status has now gone way up, and no one pays any attention months later when missiles are taken out of Turkey. Then, it so happens, a year later, John Kennedy is assassinated November 22nd, 1963. This is the whole debate about Lee Harvey Oswald and the conspiracy in Dallas, Texas, in terms of how many bullets are actually fired. A couple of related thoughts. It's the year after the Cuban Missile Crisis. There are some people who believe that Kennedy was assassinated because he was soft on the Soviet Union, and it might have actually been some kind of domestic plot. There are some people who believe that Kennedy is assassinated because he allows the March on Washington in August of 1963 with Martin Luther King. There are some people who think that he's assassinated because his brother Bobby is going after the mafia. There are some people who think it's just a Soviet plot because Lee Harvey Oswald had been to the Soviet Union, come back to the United States. And to this day, it is analyzed and analyzed and analyzed. What we do know is it was the death of an ideal, the death of an icon, and the end to Camelot. It was a very, very sad time in the United States. I was tiny, but I still remember it to this day. Many people my age and older remember what they were doing. I was playing in front of the TV. My mother comes in crying, and she turns the channel, and all I saw was people talking on TV, and days and days and days of people crying. An incredibly poignant moment in American history. So anyway, we're going to leave this segment on the 1950s into the beginning of the 1960s here for now. Remember, this PowerPoint is available on buschistory.net. Simply go to www.buschistory.net and you'll be able to download it and related materials. Also, I received a couple of emails this week. Thank you very much. I did answer them, so I hope those answers were helpful. If you have anything you think I should include in these presentations, please let me know. I'm trying to be useful with this and make it workable for as many people as possible. So, until next time, this is David Busch, and this is Busch History. Have a great day.